Hello Shack fans, here we are with chapter 6. Well, mouth open like your pants are full, said the big black woman as she turned and headed across the decking, talking the whole time. Come and talk to me while I get supper on, or if you don't want to do that, you can do whatever you want. Behind the cabin you'll find a fishing pole by the boat shed that you can use to catch some lake trout. She stopped at the door to give Jesus a kiss. Just remember, she turned to look back at Mac, you gotta clean what you catch. Then with a quick smile she disappeared into the cabin, armed with Mac's winter coat and still carrying the gun by 2 fingers, a full arm's length away from her. Mac was standing there with his mouth indeed open and an expression of bewilderment plastered on his face. He hardly noticed when Jesus walked over and put an arm around his shoulder. Sarayu seemed to have just evaporated. "Isn't she great?" exclaimed Jesus, grinning at Mac. Mac turned and faced him, shaking his head. "Am I going crazy? Am I supposed to believe that God is a big black woman with a questionable sense of humour?" Jesus laughed. "She's a riot. You can always count on her to throw you a curveball or two. She loves surprises, and even though you might not think it, her timing is always perfect." "Really?" said Mac, still shaking his head and not sure if he really believed that. "So now what am I supposed to do?" "You're not supposed to do anything. You're free to do whatever you like." Jesus paused and then continued, trying to help by giving Mac a few suggestions. "I am working on a wood project in the shed, Sarayu's in the garden, or you could go fishing, canoeing, or go in and talk to Papa." "Well, I sort of feel obligated to go and talk to him, her." "Oh," now Jesus was serious. "Don't go because you feel obligated. That won't get you any points around here. Go because it's what you want to do." Mac thought for a moment and decided that going into the cabin actually was what he wanted to do. He thanked Jesus, who smiled, turned and headed off to his workshop, and Mac stepped across the deck and up to the door. Again, he was alone, but after a quick look around, he carefully opened it. He stuck his head in, hesitated, and then decided to take the plunge. "God?" he called out, rather timidly and feeling more than a little foolish. "I'm in the kitchen, Mackenzie, just follow my voice." He walked in and scanned the room. Could this even be the same place? He shuddered at the whisper of lurking dark thoughts and again locked them out. Across the room, a hallway disappeared at an angle. Glancing around the corner into the living room, his eyes searched out the spot near the fireplace, but there was no stain marring the wood surface. He noticed that the room was decorated tastefully, with art that looked like it had been either drawn or handcrafted by children. He wondered if this woman treasured each of these pieces, like any parent who loves her children would. Maybe that was how she valued anything that was given to her from the heart, the way children seem to give so easily. Mac followed her soft humming down a short hallway and into an open kitchen dining area, complete with a small 4-seat table and wicker-backed chairs. The inside of the cabin was roomier than he had expected. Papa was working on something with her back to him, flour flying as she swayed to the music of whatever she was listening to. The song obviously came to an end, marked by a couple of last shoulder and hip shakes. Turning to face him, she took off the headphones. Suddenly, Mac wanted to ask 1,000 questions, or say 1,000 things, some of them unspeakable and terrible. He was sure that his face betrayed the emotions he was battling to control, and then in a flash of a second, he shoved everything back into his battered heart's closet, locking the door on the way out. If she knew his inner conflict, she showed nothing by her expression, still open, full of life, and inviting. He inquired, "May I ask what you're listening to?" "You really want to know?" "Sure." Now Mac was curious. "West Coast Juice, group called Diatribe, and an album that isn't even out yet called Heart Trips." "Actually," she winked at Mac, "these kids haven't even been born yet." "Right," Mac responded, more than a little incredulous. "West Coast Juice, huh? It doesn't sound very religious." "Oh, trust me, it's not. More like Eurasian funk and blues with a message and a great beat. She sidestepped towards Mac, as if she was doing a dance move, and clapped. Mac stepped back. So God listens to funk? Mac had never heard funk talked about in any properly righteous terms. I thought you would be listening to George Beverly Shea or the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, something churchier. Now see here, Mackenzie, you don't have to be looking out for me. I listen to everything. And not just to the music itself, but the hearts behind it. Don't you remember your seminary classes? These kids ain't saying anything I haven't heard before. They're just full of vinegar and fizz. Lots of anger, and I must say with some good reason too. They're just some of my kids, showing off and spouting off. I'm especially fond of these boys, Yep, I'll be keeping my eye on 'em. Mac struggled to keep up with her, to make some sense of what was happening. None of his old seminary training was helping in the least. He was at a sudden loss for words, and his million questions had all seemed to abandon him. So he stated the obvious. You must know, he offered, calling you Papa is a bit of a stretch for me. Oh, really? She looked at him in mock surprise. Of course I know. I always know. She chuckled. But tell me, why do you think it's hard for you? Is it because it's too familiar for you, or maybe because I'm showing myself as a woman, a mother, or... No small issue there, Mac interrupted with an awkward chuckle. Or maybe it's because of the failures of your own Papa. Mac gasped involuntarily. He wasn't used to having deep secrets surface so quickly and openly. Instantly guilt and anger welled up, and he wanted to lash out with a sarcastic remark in response. Mac felt as if he were dangling over a bottomless chasm, and he was afraid if he let any of it out, he would lose control of everything. He sought for safe footing, but was only partially successful, finally answering through gritted teeth. Maybe it's because I've never known anyone I could really call Papa. At that, she put down the mixing bowl that had been cradled in her arm, and, leaving the wooden spoon in it, she turned towards Mac with tender eyes. She didn't have to say it. He knew she understood what was going on inside him, and somehow he knew she cared about him more than anyone ever had. If you let me, Mac, I'll be the Papa you never had. The offer was at once inviting and at the same time repulsive. He had always wanted a Papa he could trust, but he wasn't sure he'd find it here, especially if this one couldn't even protect his Missy. A long silence hung between them. Mac was uncertain what to say, and she was in no hurry to let the moment pass easily. If you couldn't take care of my Missy, how can I trust you to take care of me? There, he'd said it. The question that had tormented him every day of the great sadness. Mac felt his face flush angry red as he stared at what he now considered to be some odd characterization of God, and he realized his hands were knotted into fists. Mac, I'm so sorry. Tears began to trail down her cheeks. I know what a great gulf this has put between us. I know you don't understand this yet, but I am especially fond of Missy. And you too. He loved the way she said Missy's name, and yet he hated it coming from her. It rolled off her tongue like the sweetest wine, and even through all the fury still raging in his mind, he somehow knew she meant it. He wanted to believe her, and slowly some of his rage began to subside. That's why you're here, Mac, she continued. I want to heal the wound that has grown inside of you, and between us. To gain some control, he turned his eyes towards the floor. It was a full minute before he had enough to whisper without looking up. I think I'd like that, he admitted. But I just don't see how... Honey, there is no easy answer that will take your pain away. Believe me, if I had one, I'd use it now. I have no magic wand to wave over you and make it all better. Life takes a bit of time and a lot of relationship. Mac was glad they were stepping back from the edge of his ugly accusation. It had scared him how near he had come to being totally overwhelmed by it. "I think it'd be easier to have this conversation if you weren't wearing a dress," he suggested, and attempted a smile, weak as it was. "If it were easier, then I wouldn't be," she said with a slight giggle. "But I'm not trying to make this harder for either of us. But this is a good place to start. I often find that getting head issues out of the way first makes the hard stuff easier to work on later, when you're ready." She picked up the wooden spoon again, dripping with some sort of batter. "Mackenzie, I am neither male nor female, even though both genders are derived from my nature. If I choose to appear to you as a man or a woman, it's because I love you. For me to appear to you as a woman and suggest that you call me Papa is simply to mix metaphors, to help you keep from falling so easily back into your religious conditioning." She leaned forward as if to share a secret. "To reveal myself to you as a very large, white grandfather figure with flowing beard like Gandalf would simply reinforce your religious stereotypes. And this weekend is not about reinforcing your religious stereotypes." Mac almost laughed out loud and wanted to say, "You think? I'm over here barely believing I'm not stark raving mad." Instead, he focused on what she had just said and regained his composure. He believed, in his head at least, that God was a spirit, neither male nor female. But in spite of that, he was embarrassed to admit to himself that all his visuals for God were very white and very male. She stopped talking, but only long enough to put away some seasonings into a spice rack on a ledge by the window, and then turned to face him again. She looked at Mac intently. "Hasn't it always been a problem for you to embrace me as your father? And after what you've been through, you couldn't very well handle a father right now, could you?" He knew she was right, and he realised the kindness and compassion in what she was doing. Somehow the way she had approached him had skirted his resistance to her love. It was strange and painful, and maybe even a little bit wonderful. "But then," he paused, still focused on staying rational, "why is there so much emphasis on you being a father? I mean, it seems to be the way you most reveal yourself." "Well," Papa responded, turning away from him and bustling around the kitchen, "there are many reasons for that, and some of them go very deep. Let me say for now that we knew once creation was broken, true fathering would be much more lacking than mothering. Don't misunderstand me, both are needed. But an emphasis on fathering is necessary because of the enormity of its absence." Mac turned away, a bit bewildered, feeling he was already in over his head. As he reflected, he looked through the window at a wild-looking garden. "You knew I would come, didn't you?" Mac said quietly. "Of course I did." She was busy again, her back to him. "Then, was I free not to come? Did I not have a choice in the matter?" Papa turned to face him, now with flour and dough in her hands. "Good question. How deep would you like to go?" She didn't wait for a response, knowing that Mac didn't have one. Instead, she asked, "Do you believe you are free to leave?" "I suppose I am. Am I?" "Of course you are. I'm not interested in prisoners. You're free to walk out that door right now and go home to your empty house. Or you could go down to the grind and hang out with Willie. Just because I know you're too curious to go, does that remove your freedom to leave?" She paused only briefly, and then turned back to her task, talking to him over her shoulder. "Or, if you want to go just a wee bit deeper, we could talk about the nature of freedom itself. Does freedom mean that you're allowed to do whatever you want to do? Or we could talk about all the limiting influences in your life that actively work against your freedom. Your family genetic heritage, your specific DNA, your metabolic uniqueness, the quantum stuff that is going on at a subatomic level where only I am the always present observer. Or the intrusion of your soul sickness that inhibits and binds you, or the social influences around you, or the habits that have created synaptic bonds and pathways in your brain. And then there's advertising, propaganda, and paradigms. Inside that confluence of multifaceted inhibitors, she sighed, what is freedom, really? Mac just stood there, not knowing what to say. Only I can set you free, Mackenzie, but freedom can never be forced. I don't understand, replied Mac. I don't even understand what you just told me. She turned back and smiled. I know. I didn't tell you so that you would understand right now. I told you for later. At this point, you don't even comprehend that freedom is an incremental process. Process. Gently reaching out, she took Mac's hands in hers, flower-covered and all, and looking him straight in the eyes, she continued, Mackenzie, the truth shall set you free, and the truth has a name. He's over in the woodshop right now, covered in sawdust. Everything is about him. And freedom is a process that happens inside a relationship with him. Then all that stuff you feel churning around inside will start to work its way out. How can you really know how I feel? Mac asked, looking back into her eyes. Papa didn't answer, only looked down at their hands. His gaze followed hers, and for the first time Mac noticed the scars in her wrists, like those he now assumed Jesus also had on his. She allowed him to tenderly touch the scars, outlines of a deep piercing, and he finally looked up again into her eyes. Tears were slowly making their way down her face, little pathways through the flour that dusted her cheeks. Don't ever think that what my son chose to do didn't cost us dearly. Love always leaves a significant mark, she stated softly and gently. We were there together. Mac was surprised. At the cross? Now wait, I thought you left him. You know, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? It was a scripture that had often haunted Mac in the great sadness. You misunderstand the mystery there. Regardless of what he felt at that moment, I never left him. How can you say that? You abandoned him just like you abandoned me. Mackenzie, I never left him, and I have never left you. That makes no sense to me, he snapped. I know it doesn't, at least not yet. Will you at least consider this? When all you can see is your pain, perhaps then you lose sight of me. When Mac did not respond, she turned back to her cooking so as to offer him a little needed space. She seemed to be preparing a number of dishes all at once, adding various spices and ingredients. Humming a haunting little tune, she put the finishing touches on the pie that she had been making and slid it into the oven. Don't forget, the story didn't end in his sense of forsakenness. He found his way through it to put himself completely into my hands. Oh, what a moment that was! Mac leaned against the counter, somewhat bewildered. His emotions and thoughts were all jumbled. Part of him wanted to believe everything Papa was saying. That would be nice. But another part was objecting rather loudly. This can't possibly be true. Papa reached for the kitchen timer, gave it a little twist and placed it on the table in front of them. I'm not who you think I am, Mackenzie. Her words weren't angry or defensive. Mac looked at her, looked at the timer and sighed. I feel totally lost. Then let's see if we can find you in this mess. Almost as if on cue, a blue jay landed on the kitchen windowsill and began strutting back and forth. Papa reached into a tin on the counter and, sliding the window open, offered Mr. J a mixture of grains she must have kept just for that purpose. Without any hesitation, and with a seeming air of humility and thankfulness, the bird walked straight to her hand and began feeding. Consider our little friend here, she began. Most birds were created to fly. Being grounded for them is a limitation within their ability to fly, not the other way around. She paused to let Mac think about her statement. You, on the other hand, were created to be loved. So for you to live as if you were unloved is a limitation, not the other way around. Mac nodded his head, not so much in full agreement, but more as a signal that at least he understood and was following. That seemed simple enough. Living unloved is like clipping a bird's wings and removing its ability to fly. Not something I want for you. There's the rub. He didn't feel particularly loved at the moment. Mac, pain has a way of clipping our wings and keeping us from being able to fly. She waited a moment, allowing her words to settle. And if left unresolved for very long, you can almost forget that you were ever created to fly in the first place. Mac was silent. Strangely, the silence was not that uncomfortable. Mac looked at the little bird. The bird looked back at Mac. He wondered if it was possible for birds to smile. At least the jay looked like he was, perhaps if only sympathetically. "I'm not like you, Mac." It wasn't a put-down, it was a simple statement of fact, but to Mac it felt like a splash of cold water. "I am God. I am who I am. And unlike you, my wings can be clipped." "Well, that's wonderful for you, but where exactly does that leave me?" Mac blurted out, sounding more irritated than he would have liked. Papa began stroking the little bird, brought him up close to her face and said, "Smack dab in the centre of my love," as the two cuddled nose to beak. "I'm thinking that bird probably understands that better than I do," was the best Mac could offer. "I know, honey. That's why we're here. Why do you think I said, 'I'm not like you'?" "Well, I really have no idea. I mean, you're God and I'm not." He couldn't keep the sarcasm out of his voice, but she ignored it completely. "Yes, but not exactly. At least not in the way you're thinking. Mackenzie, I am what some would say, holy and wholly other than you. The problem is that many folks try to grasp some sense of who I am by taking the best version of themselves, projecting that to the nth degree, factoring in all the goodness they can perceive, which often isn't much, and then call that God. And while it may seem like a noble effort, the truth is that it falls pitifully short of who I really am. I am far more than that, above and beyond all that you can ask or think. I'm sorry, but those are just words to me. They don't make much sense," Mac shrugged. "Even though you can't finally grasp me, guess what? I still want to be known." "You're talking about Jesus, right? Is this going to be a let's try to understand the Trinity sort of thing?" She chuckled. "Sort of, but this isn't Sunday school. This is a flying lesson. Mackenzie, as you might imagine, there are some advantages to being God. By nature I am completely unlimited, without bounds. I have always known fullness. I live in a state of perpetual satisfaction as my normal state of existence. Just one of the perks of me being me." That made Mac smile. This lady was fully enjoying herself, all by herself, and there wasn't an ounce of arrogance to spoil it. "We created you to share in that. But then Adam chose to go it on his own, as we knew he would, and everything got messed up. But instead of scrapping the whole creation, we rolled up our sleeves and entered into the middle of that mess. That's what we have done in Jesus." Mac was hanging in there, trying his best to follow her train of thought. "When we three spoke ourselves into human existence as the Son of God, we became fully human. We also chose to embrace all the limitations that this entailed. Even though we have always been present in this created universe, we now became flesh and blood. It would be like this bird, whose nature it is to fly, choosing only to walk and remain grounded. He doesn't stop being the bird, but it does alter his experience of life significantly." She paused to make sure Mac was still tracking. While there was a definite cramp forming in his brain, he voiced an "okay," inviting her to continue. "Although by nature he is fully God, Jesus is fully human and lives as such. While never losing the innate ability to fly, he chooses moment by moment to remain grounded. That is why his name is Emmanuel, God with us, or God with you to be more precise. But what about all the miracles, the healings, raising people from the dead? Doesn't that prove that Jesus was God, more than human? No, it proves that Jesus is truly human. What? Mackenzie, I can fly, but humans can't. Jesus is fully human. Although he is also fully God, he has never drawn upon his nature as God to do anything. He has only lived out of his relationship with me, living in the very same manner that I desire to be in relationship with every human being. He is just the first to do it to the uttermost, the first to be absolutely trust my life within him, the first to believe in my love and my goodness without regard for appearance or consequence. So, when he healed the blind, he did so as a dependent, limited human being, trusting in my life and power to be at work within him and through him. Jesus, as a human being, had no power within himself to heal anyone. That came as a shock to Mac's religious system. Only he rested in his relationship with me, and in our communion, our co-union, could he express my heart and will into any given circumstance. So when you look at Jesus and it appears that he's flying, he really is flying. But what you're actually seeing is me, my life in him. That's how he lives and acts as a true human, how every human is designed to live out of my life. A bird's not defined by being grounded, but by his ability to fly. Remember this, humans are not defined by their limitations, but by the intentions that I have for them. Not by what they seem to be, but by everything it means to be created in my image. Mac felt the onset of information overload, so he pulled up a chair and just sat down. This would take some time to get his head around. So, does that mean you were limited when Jesus was on earth? Did you limit yourself only to Jesus? Not at all. Although I have only been limited in Jesus, I've never been limited in myself. There's that whole Trinity thing, which is where I kind of get lost. Mac laughed, a long, rich belly laugh that made Mac want to join in. Papa laughed, a long, rich belly laugh that made Mac want to join in. She sat the little bird down on the table next to Mac, turned to open the oven, and gave the pie that was baking a quick little look. Satisfied that everything was fine, Papa then pulled up a chair alongside them. Mac looked at the little bird who, amazingly, was content to just sit there with them. The absurdity of it all gave Mac a chuckle. To begin with, that you can't grasp the wonder of my nature is rather a good thing. Who wants to worship a God who can be fully comprehended, eh? Not much mystery in that. But what difference does it make that there are 3 of you and you are all one God? Did I say that right? Right enough, she grinned. Mackenzie, it makes all the difference in the world. She seemed to be enjoying this. We are not 3 gods. And we're not talking about one God with 3 attitudes, like a man who is a husband, father and worker. I am one God and I'm 3 persons, and each of the 3 is fully and entirely the one. The huh? Mac had been suppressing. The huh Mac had been suppressing finally surfaced in all its glory. Never mind that, she continued. What's important is this. If I were simply one God and only one person, then you would find yourself in this creation without something wonderful, without something essential even. And I would be utterly other than I am. And we would be without? Mac didn't even know how to finish the question. Love and relationship. All love and relationship is possible for you only because it already exists within me, within God myself. Love is not the limitation. Love is the flying. I am love. As if in response to her declaration, the timer dinged, and the little bird took off and flew out of the window. Watching the jay in flight took on a whole new level of delight. He turned back to Papa and just stared at her in wonder. She was so beautiful and astonishing, and even though he was feeling a little lost, and even though the great sadness still attended him, he felt himself settling down somewhat into the safety of being close to her. You do understand, she continued, that unless I had an object to love, or more accurately, a someone to love, if I did not have such a relationship within myself, then I would not be capable of love at all. you would have a God who could not love. Or maybe worse, you would have a God who, when he chose, could only love as a limitation of his nature. That kind of God could possibly act without love, and that would be a disaster. And that is surely not me. With that, Papa stood up, went to the oven door, pulled out the freshly baked pie, set it on the counter, and turning around as if to present herself, said, "The God who is, the I am who I am, cannot act apart from love." Mac knew that what he was hearing, as hard as it was to understand, was something amazing and incredible. It was as if her words were wrapping themselves around him, embracing him, and speaking to him in ways beyond just what he could hear. Not that he actually believed any of it. If only it were true. His experience told him otherwise. This weekend is about relationship and love. Now I know you have a lot you want to talk to me about, but right now you better go wash up. The other two are on their way in for supper. She began to walk away, but paused and turned back. "Mackenzie, I know that your heart is full of pain and anger and a lot of confusion. Together, you and I, we'll get around to some of that while you're here. But I also want you to know that there is more going on than you could imagine or understand, even if I told you. As much as you are able, rest in what trust you have in me, no matter how small, okay?" Mac had lowered his head and was looking at the floor. She knows, he thought. Small? His little must be barely to the right of none. Nodding agreement, he looked up and noticed again the scars on her wrists. "Papa?" Mac finally said in a way that felt very awkward, but he was trying. "Yes, honey?" Mac struggled for the words to tell her what was in his heart. "I'm so sorry that Jesus had to die." She walked around the table and gave Mac another big hug. "I know you are, and thank you. But you need to know that we aren't sorry at all. It was worth it. Isn't that right, son?" She turned to ask her question of Jesus, who had just entered the cabin. "Absolutely." He paused and then looked at Mac. "And I would have done it even if it were only for you. But it wasn't," he said with an inviting grin. Mac excused himself and found the bathroom, where he washed his hands and his face and tried to collect himself. Oh, I've got an ant walking across my screen. It obviously enjoys the shack too. Bye.